I know only one way to judge a man's brilliance, and that's by the size of his bank account.
Greetings, gamers! Welcome one and all. It is I, Ape of the Horror, back at it again on a Saturday evening. How are you all doing? I hope you're doing well. I thought I heard something go bump. It's probably me. Knowing what I've been up to. How y'all doing? I hope you're doing well. I'm drinking a Polar Seltzer, apple and lemon. It's quite good. I enjoyed it. It's quite good. But I hope you're doing well this evening. I decided to do something a little bit different, do something somewhat of a variety stream sort of dealio. I'm going to be reading spooky stories as inspired by my good friend Kimmy Spice, who a while ago on her stream read The Metamorphosis as part of it. So I thought it'd be cool to do something like that for the Halloween season. So, without any further ado, we're going to get right into it. I'm going to switch windows here. I need to change the setting. As much as I'd love to read stories in a graveyard, it's a little too weird for my tastes. I need someplace classy. So we're going to go to the library. A very spooky library, that is. But anyway, first on the docket, we are going to read one of my favorite poems from the ultimate classic, the ultimate in American romance writing, the ultimate in Gothic horror, from Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to warm up by reading The Raven. If you have a copy of this book, or this poem on you, you can feel free to read along, as I do. If you don't, it is public domain, so you can probably look it up online and do it yourself. I just have a printed copy of it myself. But anyway, without any further ado, let's get right into it. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished to the morrow, vainly I sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, this it is and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I open wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more." Deep in the darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echo murmured back, "Lenore!" Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is someone at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter in stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but by means of lord and lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Also, hey there, Peach, I'm reading The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. I noticed the chat one moment. Let me fix the chat there. I was just looking and I see it's really squashed. Let me stretch you all out a little bit. If I can do that. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay. Anyway. Oh no, who sat on me? All right, one moment. I'm switching back. Let me go back to reading. Now, where was I? Ah, here we go. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, said I, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on this night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to gain discourse so plainly, though its answers little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing a bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculpted bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, nothing feather that he fluttered, not a feather he did flutter, till I scarcely more than muttered, Other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. The bird said, Nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, Doubtless, said I, what it utters is only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmercifully disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hopes that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking, Nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight glowed o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight glowed o'er. She shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from some unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls twinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by the angels he hath sent thee, respite, and repent thee for thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter or sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore. Is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by the heaven that bends above us, by the God we both adore, tell this soul in sorrow laden, if there is still Aden, it shall clasp a saint, if it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels named Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels named Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked up starting. Get thee back into the tempest in the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as token of that lie that thee hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow lies there floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. I put some freestyle beats as you're reading. No, it's gonna be fire. It's funny you say that, Peach, because when I was in high school, one of our tasks in one of my English classes is that we had to perform The Raven like a freestyle rap. We had to perform it like a rap with like a beat and everything. And we had to go like, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. You know, things like that. While everybody else is like, it was very funny. But thus concludes The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to move on to another story by Edgar Allan Poe, because I like me some Edgar Allan Poe. We are going to read my favorite story, my favorite short story by Edgar Allan Poe, which is A Telltale Heart. If you didn't know, A Telltale Heart is the influence for the Boots episode of SpongeBob. Not many people know that, but it is. Now, let me see. I gotta open up my other book. Thy beats and verses are stricken with the plague. Oh, my goodness. Let's see, where would it be? There's Cask of Amontillado. I should read that too, but I don't know. There we go. A Telltale Heart. Okay. A Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Narrated by Ape of the Hour. True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I had heard all things in the heavens and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. One moment. I'm reading the chat here. There's a lovely vase I want to get that's based off the Telltale Heart. It's a vase of... Oh, that's really cool! With a heart with a sword in it. That's really dope! Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. Hearken and observe how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night about midnight I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when he had made an opening sufficient enough for my head, I put in... When I opened it, excuse me. I lost my place there. And then, when I made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust my head in. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far I could see him as he lay upon the bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. but I found the eye was always closed, so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night just at 12 I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door, and watched a watch's minute hand moves more quickly than mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers. I'm gonna be in the kitchen working on a shepherd's pie, but I be lurking. Okay, no problem, Peach. I'll be your audiobook for the time being. Never before that night have I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagecy. I could scarcely contain my feeling of triumph to think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he had not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now, you may think I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quiet still, and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in his bed listening, just as I had done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief, oh no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. By many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it had welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo, and the terrors that distracted me. I knew it well. I knew what the old man had felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, and when he turned in his bed, his fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney, it is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket that made a single chirp." Yes. He had been trying to comfort himself with all these suppositions, but he had found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his dark shadow before him and enveloped the victim, and it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until, at length, a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had not directed the ray as if by instinct. For I directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as the sound that a watch makes when enveloped in cotton, I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates a soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could to maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? Have I told you that I am nervous? So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me into uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. For many minutes the heart beat on him with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and felt it there 3 minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no longer. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precaution I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off all the head and the arms and the legs. Then I took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all of... Ha! When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it, and with a light heart, for what have I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicious of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search, and search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I had chairs set up in the room, and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, and while I made myself, in the wild audacity of the perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease, and they sat while I answered cheerily, and they chatted of familiar things. But ere longer I felt myself getting pale, and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat, and still chatted, and the ringing became more distinct. It continued, and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued, and gained definitiveness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently, and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, such as a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently. The noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations. The voice steadily increased. What would they have... excuse me. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro, and with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh, God! What could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and grated it upon the boards. The noise arose over all, and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no! They heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear these hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. Now, again, hark! Louder! 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 Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more! I admit the deed! Tear up the planks! Here! Here! It is the beating of his hideous heart! And that was A Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. I hope you enjoyed that one, folks. Next, we're going to switch things up. We're going to get out of Poe. Well, one moment. I'm going to quaff from my can of seltzer. If you didn't know, quaff means to take a very deep drink. We're going to switch it up. We're going to move on to another story. No. What could I read? What could I read here? I think I'm staring at a very big, thick book of Lovecraft. I think I'm going to read some Lovecraft. So I'm going to pick out a story. Let me take a look here. Let's see, I have my big, thick H.P. Lovecraft, Great Tales of Horror. Here, let's take a look. I think I'm going to read on something long, but I don't want it to be too terribly long. Flipping my pages here. Let's see. One moment. All right. I am going to read The Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, this is a rather long story, but I'm going to try to get through this as much as possible. West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of the sunlight. On the gentler slopes, there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss-coated cottages, brooding eternally over old New England secrets in the lee of great ledges. But these are all vacant now, the wide chimneys crumbling and the shingle sides bulging perilously beneath low gambrel roofs. The old folk have gone away, and the foreigners do not like to live here. French Canadians have tried it, Italians have tried it, and the Poles have come and departed. It's not because of anything that can be seen or heard or handled, but because of something that is imagined. The place is not good for the imagination, and does not bring restful dreams at night. It must be this which keeps the foreigners away, and for Amy Pierce has never told them of anything he recalls from the strange days. Amy, whose head has been a little queer for years, is the only one who still remains, or whoever talks of the strange days, and he dares to do this because his house is so near the open fields and the traveled roads around Arkham. There was once a road over the hills and through the valleys that ran straight there where the blasted heath is now, where people ceased to use it, and a new road was laid curving far towards the south. Traces of the old one can still be found amidst the weeds of returning wilderness, and some of them will doubtless linger even when half the hollows are flooded for the new reservoir. Then the dark woods will be cut down, and the blasted heath will slumber far below blue waters whose surface will mirror the sky and ripple in the sun. And the secrets of the strange days will be one with the deep's secrets, one with the hidden lore of old ocean, all the mystery of primal earth. When I went into the hills and vales to survey the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil. They'd told me this in Arkham, and because this is a very old town full of witch legends, I thought that the evil must be something which grandmams had whispered to children through the centuries. The name Blasted Heath seemed to me very odd and theatrical, and I wondered how it had come into the folklore of a Puritan people. Then I saw the dark westward tangle of glens and slopes for myself, and ceased to wonder at anything beside its own elder mystery. It was morning when I saw it, but shadows lurked always there. The trees grew too thickly, and their trunks were too big for any healthy New England wood. There was too much silence in the dim alleys between them, and the floors were too soft with dank moss and mattings of infinite years of decay. In the open spaces, mostly along the line of the old road, there was little hillside farms, sometimes with all the buildings standing, sometimes with only one or two, and sometimes with a lone chimney or a fast-falling cellar. Weeds and briars reigned, and furtive wild things rustled in the undergrowth. Upon everything was a haze of restlessness and oppression, a touch of the unreal and the grotesque, as if some vital element of perspective or Cagliostro was awry. I did not wonder that the foreigners would not stay, for this was no region to sleep in. It was too much like a landscape of Salvator Rosa, too much like a forbidden woodcut in a tale of horror. But even all this was not so bad as the blasted heath. I knew it the moment I came upon it at the bottom of a spacious valley, for no other name could fit such a thing, or no other thing fit such a name. It was as if the poet had coined the phrase from having seen this one particular region. It must, I thought, as I viewed it, be the outcome of a fire. But why had nothing ever grown over the 5 acres of gray desolation that sprawled open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields? It lay largely to the north of the ancient road, but encroached a little on the other side. I felt an odd reluctance about approaching, and did so at last only because my business took me through and past it. There was no vegetation of any kind on that broad expanse, and the only fine gray dust or ash which wind seemed to ever blow about. There was no vegetation of any kind on that broad expanse, but only a fine gray dust or ash which no wind seemed to ever blow about. The trees near it were sickly and stunted, and many dead trunks stood or lay rotting at the rim. As I walked hurriedly by, I saw the tumbled bricks, stones of an old chimney and cellar on my right, and the yawning black maw of an abandoned well, whose stagnant vapors played strange tricks with hues of the sunlight. Even the long, dark woodland climb beyond seemed welcome in contrast. I marveled no more at the frightened whispers of Arkan people. There had been no house or ruin near. Even in the old days, the place must have been lonely and remote. And at midnight, dreading to repass that ominous spot, I walked circuitously back to the town and curving road on the south. I vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep sky voids above had crept into my soul. In the evening, I asked old people in Arkham about the blasted heath, and what was meant by the phrase strange days, which so many evasively muttered. I could not, however, get any good answers, except that all the mystery was much more recent than I had dreamed. It was not a matter of old legendary at all, but something within the lifetimes of those who spoke. It had happened in the 80s, and the family had disappeared or was killed. Speakers would not be exact, and because they all told me to pay no attention to old Amy Pierce, this is crazy tales, I sought him out the next morning, having heard that he lived alone in the ancient tottery cottage where the trees first began to get very thick. It was a fearsome, archaic place, and had begun to exude the faint miasmal odor which clings about houses that have stood too long. Only with persistent knocking could I rouse the aged man, and when he shuffled timidly to the door, I could tell he was not glad to see me. He was not so feeble as I had expected, and his eyes drooped in a curious way, and his unkempt clothing and white beard made him seem very worn and dismal. Not knowing just how he could have been launched on his tales, I feigned a matter of business, told him of my surveying, and asked vague cautions about the district. He was far brighter and more educated than I had been led to think, and before I knew I had grasped quite as much of the subject as any man I talked to in Arkham. He was not like other rustics I had known in the sections where reservoirs were to be. From him there were no protests at miles of old wood and farmland to be blotted out, though perhaps there would have been had not his home laid outside the bounds of the future lake. Relief was all he shewed. Relief at the doom of the dark ancient valleys through which he had roamed all his life. They were better underwater now, better underwater since the strange days, and with this opening his husky voice sank low, when his body leaned forward and his right forefinger began to point shakenly and impressively. It was then that I heard the story, and as the rambling voice scraped and whispered on, I shivered again and again despite the summer days. Often I had to recall fading parrot memory of professors' talk, or bridge over gaps where his sense of logic and continuity broke down. When he was done, I did not wonder that his mind had snapped a trifle, or that the folks of Arkham would not speak much of the blasted heath. I hurried back before sunset to my hotel, unwilling to have the stars come out above me in the open, and the next day returned to Boston to give up my position. I could not go into that dim chaos of old forest and slope again, or face another time that gray-blasted heath where the black well yawned deep beside the tumbled bricks and stones. The reservoir will soon be built now, and all those elder secrets will be safe forever underneath watery fathoms. But even then, I do not believe I would like to visit that country by night, at least not when the sinister stars are out, and nothing could bribe me to drink the new city water of Arkham. It all began, old Amy said, with the meteorite. Before that time, there had been no wild legends at all since the witch trials, and even then these western woods were not feared half so much as the small island of the Miskatonic, where the devil held court beside a curious stone altar older than the Indians. There were not haunted woods, and their fantastic dusk was never terrible till the strange days. Then there come the white noontide cloud, the stirring of explosions in the air, and that pillar of smoke from the valley far in the woods. And by night all Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell out of the sky and bedded itself in the ground beside the well of the Nahum Gardner place. There was the house which stood where the blasted heath was to come, the trim white Nahum Gardner house amidst its fertile gardens and orchards. Nahum had come to town to tell people about the stone, and had dropped in at Amy Pierce's on the way. Amy was 40 then, and all the queer things were fixed very strongly in his mind. He and his wife had gone with the 3 professors from the Miskatonic University, who hastened out the next morning to see the weird visitor from unknown stellar space, and had wondered why Nahum had called it so large the day before. It had shrunk, and Nahum said it as he pointed out the big brownish mound above the ripped earth and charred grass near the archaic well sweep in his front yard. But the wise men answered that stones do not shrink. But the wise men answered that stones do not shrink. Its heat lingered persistently, and Nahum declared it had glowed faintly in the night. The professors tried it with a geologist's hammer and found it oddly soft. It was, in truth, so soft as to be almost plastic, and they gouged rather than chipped a specimen to take back to the college for testing. They took it to an old pail borrowed from Nahum's garden, for even the small piece refused to grow cold. And the trip back they stopped at Amy's to rest, and seemed thoughtful when Mr. Pierce remarked that the fragment was growing smaller and burning at the bottom of the pail. Truly, it was not large, but perhaps they had taken less than they had thought. The day after, all this was in June of 82. By the way, that's 1882. The professors had trooped out again in great excitement. As they passed Amy's, they told him what queer things the specimen had done, and how it had faded wholly away when they put it in the glass beaker. The beaker had gone too, and the wise men talked of the strange stone's affinity for silicon. It had acted quite unbelievably in the well-ordered laboratory, doing nothing at all and showing no occluded gases when heated on charcoal, but being wholly negative in the borax bead, and soon proving itself absolutely non-volatile at any producible temperature, including that of the oxyhydrogen blowpipe. On an anvil it appeared highly malleable, and in dark its luminosity was very marked. Stubbornly refusing to grow cool, it soon had the college in a state of real excitement. And when upon heating before the spectroscope, it displayed shining bands unlike any known colors of the normal spectrum. There was much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science are wont to say when faced by the unknown. Hot as it was, they tested it in a crucible with all the proper regiments. Water did nothing. Hydrochloric acid was the same. Nitric acid and even aqua regia merely hissed and spattered against its torrid invulnerability. By the way, aqua regia is for those that don't know, aqua regia is like a liquid with like gold that's been dissolved in it. A little fancy science fact for you there. But anyway, where was I? Amy had had difficulty in recalling all these things, but recognized some solvents as I mentioned them in the usual order of use. There were ammonia and caustic soda, alcohol and ether, nauseous carbon dissolidified, and dozens others. But although the weight grew steadily less as time passed, the fragment seemed to be slightly cooling. There was no change in the solvents that show that they had attacked the substance at all. It was a metal, it was a metal, though, beyond a doubt. It was magnetic, for one thing, and after its immersion in acid solvents, there seemed to be faint traces of Widmanstätten figures found on meteoric iron. H.P. Lovecraft, why do you gotta use such hard words to pronounce? Anyway, meteoric iron. When the cooling had grown very considerable, the testing was carried on in glass, and it was in a glass beaker that they left the chips made of the original fragment during the work. The next morning, both chips and beaker had gone without a trace, and only a charred spot marked the place on the wooden shelf where they had been. All this the professor has told Amy as they paused at his door once more when he went with them to see the stony messenger from the stars, though this time his wife did not accompany him. It had now most certainly shrunk, and even the sober professor could not doubt the truth of what they saw. All around the dwindling brown lump near the well was a vacant space where the earth had caved in, and whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot, and the sages studied its surface cautiously as they detached another large piece with a hammer and chisel. They gouged deeply this time, and they pried away the smaller mass that they had saw at the core of the thing, but was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large colored globule embedded in the surface. The color, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they called it a color at all. Its texture was glossy, and upon tapping it, it appeared to promise both brittleness and hollowness. It was one of the professors who gave it a smart blow with a hammer, and it burst with a nervous little pop. Nothing was admitted, and all trace of the thing vanished with the puncturing. It left behind a hollow spherical space about 3 inches across, and all thought it was probable that others would have discovered as the enclosing substance wasted away. Conjecture was vain, so after a futile attempt to find additional globules by drilling, the seekers left again with their new specimen, which proved, however, as baffling in the laboratory as its predecessor had been. Aside from being almost plastic, having heat, magnetism, and slight lumosity, cooling slightly in powerful acids, possessing an unknown spectrum, wasting away in air, and attacking silicon compounds with mutual destruction as a result, it presented no identifying features whatsoever, and at the end of the tests, the college scientists were forced to own that they could not place it. It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of great outside, and as much dour with outside properties and obedient to outside laws. That night there was a thunderstorm, and when the professors went out to Nahum's the next day, they were met with a bitter disappointment. The stone, magnetic as it had been, must have had some peculiar electrical property, for it had drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with a singular persistence. 6 times within an hour the farmer saw the lightning strike the furrow in the front yard, and when the storm was over nothing remained but a ragged pit by the ancient well sweep, half choked with caved-in earth. Digging had bore no fruit, and the scientists verified the fact of the utter vanishment. The failure was total, so that nothing was left to do but cased in lead. Oh, sorry. Nothing was left to go back to the laboratory and test again the disappeared fragment left and carefully cased in lead. The fragment lasted a week, and at the end of which nothing of value had been learned from it. When it had gone, no residue was left, and in time the professors felt scarcely sure that they had indeed seen with waking eyes the cryptic vestige of the fathomless gulfs outside, that lone, weird message from other universes and other realms of matter, force, and entity. As was natural, the Arkham people made much of the incident with its collegiate sponsoring and sent reporters to talk with Nahum Gardner and his family. At least one Boston daily also sent a scribe, and Nahum quickly became kind of a local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person of about 50, living with his wife and 3 sons on the pleasant farmstead in the valley. He and Amy exchanged visits frequently, as did their wives, and Amy had nothing but praise for him after all these years. He had seemed slightly proud of the notice his place had attracted. He seemed slightly proud of the notice his place had attracted, and talked often of the meteorite in the succeeding weeks. That July and August were hot, and Nahum worked hard as haying in the 10-acre pasture across Chapham's Brook, his rattling wain wearing deep ruts in the shadowy lanes between. The labor tired him more than it had in other years, and he felt that age was beginning to tell on him. Then fell the time of fruit and harvest. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwanted gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sore disappointment, for all that gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat. The fine flavor of the pears and apples had crept stealthily bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest of bites induced a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw his entire crop was lost. Quick to connect events, he declared that the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heaven that most of the other crops were in the upland lot along the road. Winter came early, and was very cold. Amy saw Nahum less often than usual, and observed that he had begun to look worried. The rest of his family, too, their appearance at the various social events of the country, countryside. For this reserve or melancholy, no cause could be found, though all the household confessed now and then to poorer health or feeling a vague disquiet. Nahum himself gave the most definite statement of anyone when he said he was disturbed about certain rabbits and foxes. He was disturbed by certain footprints in the snow. Then were the usual winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes, but the brooding farmer professed to see something not quite right about their nature and arrangement. He was never specific, but he appeared to think that they were not a characteristic of anatomy and habits of squirrels and rabbits and foxes as they ought to be. Amy listened without interest to this talk, and one night when he drove past Nahum's home in his sleigh on the way back from Clark's Corners, there had been a moon, and a rabbit had run across the road, and the leap of that rabbit was longer than either Amy or his horse liked. The latter, indeed, had almost run away when brought up by a firm rein. Thereafter, Amy gave Nahum's tales more respect, and wondered why the gardener's dogs seemed so cowed and quivering every morning. They had, it developed, nearly lost the spirit to bark. In February, the McGregor boys of the Meadow Hill were out shooting woodchucks, and not far from the Gardner place bagged a very peculiar specimen. The proportions of its body seemed slightly altered in a queer way impossible to describe, while its face had taken on an expression which no one had ever seen in a woodchuck before. The boys were genuinely frightened, and they threw the thing away at once, so that only their grotesque tales of it ever reached the people of the countryside. But the shying away of the horses near Nahum's house had now become a knowledgeable thing, and all the basis for a cycle of whispered legend which was fast taking form. People vowed that the snow melted faster around Nahum's than it did anywhere else. And early in March, there had been an odd discussion in Potter's General Store at Clark's Corners. Stephen Rice had driven past Gardner's in the morning and had noticed skunk cabbages coming up through the mud from the woods across the road. Never were things of such size seen before, and they had very strange colors that could not be put into any words. Their shapes were monstrous, and the horse had snorted at an odor which struck Stephen as wholly unpleasant. That afternoon, several persons drove past to see the abnormal growth, and all agreed that the plants of that kind ought never to sprout into a healthy world. The bad fruit of the fall before was freely mentioned, and it went from mouth to mouth, and there was poison in Nahum's ground. Of course, it was the meteorite, and remembering how strange the men from the college had found the stone to be, several farmers spoke about the matter to them. One day they paid Nahum a visit, but having no love of wild tales or folklore, were very conservative in what they inferred. The plants were certainly odd, but all skunk cabbages are more or less odd in shape and odor and hue. Perhaps some mineral element from the stone had entered the soil, but it would soon be washed away. And as for the footprints and frightened horses, of course this was mere country talk, which such a phenomenon as the aeolite would be certain to start. There is really nothing for serious men to do in cases of wild gossip, for superstitious rustics will say and believe anything. And so all through the strange days the professors stayed away in contempt. Only one of them, though, who given 2 files of dust for analysis in a police job over a year and a half, recalled the queer color of that skunk cabbage had been very like one of the anomalous bands of light shown by the meteorite fragment in the college spectroscope, and like the brittle globule found embedded in the stone from the abyss. The samples in this analysis gave the same odd bands at first, and though later they lost the prosperity. Though later they lost the property. The trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son, Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that they swayed also when there was no wind. But even the gossip could not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed the habit of stealthily listening, though not for any sound which they could consciously name. The listening was, indeed, rather a product of moments when consciousness seemed half to slip away. Unfortunately, such moments increased week by week, till it became common speech that something was wrong with all Nahum's folks. When the early saxifrage, I believe that's how that's pronounced, saxifrage came out, it had another strange color, not quite like that of the skunk cabbage, but plainly related and equally unknown to anyone who saw it. Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham and showed them to the editor of the Gazette, but But that dignitary did no more than write a humorous article about them, in which the dark fears of rustics were held to polite ridicule. It was a mistake of Nahum's to tell a stolid city man about the way the great, overgrown, morning-cloaking butterflies behaved in connection with the saxifrages. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began the disuse of the road past Nahum's, which led to its ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchard trees blossomed forth in strange colors, and though the stony soil of the yard and adjacent pasture that sprang up a bizarre growth which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region, no sane, wholesome colors were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage, but everywhere those hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased underlying primary tone, without a place among the known tints of earth. The Dutchman's breeches became a thing of sinister menace, and the bloodroots grew insolent in their chromatic perversions. Amy and the gardeners thought that most of the colors had a sort of haunting familiarity, and decided that they were reminded of the brittle globule in the meteor. Nahum plowed and sowed the 10-acre pasture and the upland lot, and did nothing with the land around the house. He knew it would be of no use, and hoped that the summer's strange growths would have drawn all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now, and had grown used to the sense of something near him waiting to be heard. The shunning of his house by neighbors told on him, of course, but it told on his wife more. The boys were better off, being at school each day, but they could not help being frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, an especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. In May, the insects came, and Nahum's place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most of the creatures seemed not quite usual in their aspects and motions, and their nocturnal habits contradicted all former experience. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions, at random or for something. They could not tell what. It was then that they all owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Miss Gardner was the next to see it from the window as she moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come into everything growing now. Yet it was none of Nahum's family at all who made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, and what they could not see was glimpsed by timid wood-mill salesmen from Bolton who drove by one night in ignorance of the country legends. He told in Arkham he was given a short paragraph in the Gazette. What he told in Arkham was given in a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all the farmers, Nahum included, saw first. The night had been dark, and buggy lamps faint, but around a farm in the valley, which everyone knew from the account must be Nahum's, the darkness had been less thick. A dim through distinct lumosity seemed to inhere all the vegetation, grasses, leaves, and blossoms alike, while at one moment a detached piece of the phosphorescence appeared to disturb fervently in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pastured in the lot near the house. But towards the end of May, the milk began to be bad. Then Nahum had the cows driven in the uplands, after which the trouble ceased. Not long after this, the change in grass and leaves became apparent to the eye. All the verdure was going gray, and was developing a highly singular quality of brittleness. Amy was now the only person who ever visited the place, and his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. When school closed, the Gardners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Amy do their errands in town. They were failing curiously about both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised when the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteor's fall, and the poor woman screamed about things in the air which she could not describe. In her raving there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to pulses which were not wholly sounds. Something was taken away. She was being drained of something. Something had fastened itself on her that ought not to be. Someone must make it keep off. Nothing was ever still in the night. The walls and windows shifted. Nahum did not send her to the county asylum, but let her wander about the house as long as she was harmless to herself and others. Even when her expression changed, he did nothing. But when the boys grew afraid of her, and Thaddeus nearly fainted at the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked in the attic. By July she had ceased to speak and crawled on all fours, and before the month was over Nahum got the mad notion that she was slightly luminous in the dark, and he now clearly saw was the case with the nearby vegetation. One moment, folks. I'm going to take a drink real quick. Take a little sip. Reading can really dry out my throat. Anyway, back to reading. It was a little before this that the horses had stamped. Something had aroused them in the night, and their neighing and kicking in their stalls had been terrible. There seemed virtually nothing to do to calm them, and when Nahum opened the stable door, they all bolted out like frightened woodland deer. It took a week to track all four, and when found, they had been seen to be quite useless and unmanageable. Something had snapped in their brains, and each one of them had to be shot for its own good. Nahum borrowed a horse from Amy for his haying, but found it would not approach the barn. It shied, it balked, and it whinnied, and in the end he could do nothing but drive it into the yard while the men used their own strength to get the heavy wagon near enough to that hayloft for convenient pitching. All while the vegetation was turning gray and brittle. Even the flowers, whose hues had been so strange, were graying now, and the fruit was coming out gray and dwarfed and tasteless. The asters and goldenrod bloomed gray and distorted, and the roses and zinnias and hollylock in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Nahum's oldest son, Zenos, cut them down. The strangely puffed insects died about that time. Even the bees had left their hives and taken to the woods. By September, all the vegetation was fast crumbling into grayish powder, and Nahum feared that the trees would die before the poison was out of the soil. His wife had spells of terrific screaming, and he and the boys were in a constant state of nervous tension. They shunned people now, and when school opened the boys did not go. But it was Amy, on one of the rare visits, who first realized that the well water was no longer good. It had an evil taste that was not exactly fetid, nor exactly salty, and Amy advised his friend to dig another well on higher ground to use till the soil was good again. Nahum, however, ignored the warning, for he had by that time become callous to strange and unpleasant things. He and the boys continued to use the tainted supply, drinking it as listlessly and mechanically as they ate their meager and ill-cooked meals and did their thankless and monotonous chores through the aimless days. There was something of stolid resignation about them all, as if they walked half in another world between lines of nameless guard to a certain and familiar doom. Thaddeus went mad in September after a visit to the well. He had gone with a pail, and he came back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, and sometimes lapsing into an insane titter or whisper about the moving colors down there. 2 in one family was pretty bad, and Nahum was very brave about it. He let the boys run out for a week until he began stumbling and hurting himself, and then he shut him in an attic and across the hall from his mother's. The way they screamed at each other from behind their locked doors was very terrible, especially to little Merwin, who fancied that they talked in some terrible language that was not of earth. Merwin was getting frightfully imaginative, and his restlessness was worse after the shutting away of the brother who had been his greatest playmate. Almost at the same time, the morality among the livestock commenced. Poultry turned grayish and died very quickly, their meat being found dry and noisome upon cutting. Hogs grew inordinately fat, and then suddenly began to undergo loathsome changes which no one could explain. Their meat was of course uselessness, and Nahum was at his wit's end. No rural veterinary would approach his place, and the city veterinary from Arkham was openly baffled. The swine began growing gray and brittle and falling into pieces before they died, and their eyes and muzzles developed strange alterations. It was very inexplicable, for they had never fed from the tainted vegetation. Then something struck the cows. Certain areas and sometimes the whole body would be uncannily shriveled or compressed, and atrocious collapses or indigestion were common. In the last stages, and death was always the result, there would be a graying and turning brittle like that which beset the hogs. There could be no question of poison, for all the cases occurred in a locked and undisturbed barn. No bites of prowling things could have brought the virus, for what live beast of earth could pass through solid obstacles? It must be only natural disease. Yet what disease could wreak such results was beyond any mind's guessing. When the harvest came, there was not an animal surviving on the place, for the stock and poultry were dead, and the dogs had ran away. These dogs, 3 in number, had all vanished one night, and they were never heard from again. The 5 cats had left some time before, and their going was scarcely noticed since there seemed to be no mice, and only Mrs. Gardner had made pets of the graceful felines. On the 19th of October, Nahum staggered into Amy's house with hideous news. The death had come to poor Thaddeus in his attic, and it had come in a way which could not be told. Nahum had dug a grave in the railed family plot behind the farm, and had put therein what he found. There could have been nothing from outside, for small barred window and locked door were intact. Were intact, but it was such as it had been in the barn. Amy and his wife consoled the stricken man as best they could, but shuddered as they did so. Stark terror had seemed to cling around the Gardners and all they touched, and the very presence of one in the house was a breath from regions unnamed and unnameable. Amy accompanied Nahum home with the greatest reluctance, and did what he might to calm the hysterical sobbing of little Merwin. Zenas needed no calming. He had come of late to do nothing but stare into space and obey what his father told him, and Amy thought that this fate was very merciful. Now and then Merwin's screams were answered faintly from the attic. In response to inquiring look, Nahum said that his wife was getting very feeble. When night approached, Amy managed to get away, for not even friendship could make him stay in that spot when the faint glow of the vegetation began, and the trees may or may not have swayed without wind. It was really lucky for Amy that he was not more imaginative. Even as things were, his mind was bent over so slightly, but he had been able to connect and reflect upon all the portents around him. He must inevitably have turned a total maniac. In the twilight he hastened home, and the screams of the madwoman and nervous child ringing horribly in his ears. I'm listening to this while I play Salmon Run, really enjoying the story time. Well, thank you, Casper. This is an interesting story to hear while playing Salmon Run. Anyway, back to where I was. I think I have... How many pages do I have to go in the story? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 more pages, I think. One moment, I'm going to take another sip. Okay. Back to story time. 3 days later, Nahum lurched into Amy's kitchen in the early morning, and in the absence of his host stammered out a desperate tale once more, while Mrs. Pierce listened in a clutching fright. It was little Merwin this time. He was gone. He had gone out late at night with a lantern and pail for water, and had never come back. He'd been going to pieces for days, hardly knew what he was about. Screamed at everything. There had been a frantic shriek from the yard then, but before the father could get to the door, the boy was gone. There was no glow from the lantern he had taken. The child himself, no trace. At the time, Nahum thought the lantern and pail were gone too, but when dawn came, the man had plodded back from all his night search of the woods and fields. He had found some very curious things near the well. There was a crushed and apparently somewhat melted mass of iron, which had certainly been the lantern, while a bent bale and twisted iron hoops beside it, both half fused, seemed to hint at the remnants of the pail. That was all. Nahum was past imagining. Miss Pierce was blank, and Amy, when he had reached home and heard the tale, could give no guess. Merwin was gone, and there would be no use in telling the people around, who shunned all gardeners now. No use either in telling the city people of Arkham, who laughed at everything. Thad was gone, and now Murney, too, was gone, too. Something was creeping and waiting to be seen and felt and heard. Nahum would go soon, and he wanted Amy to look after his wife and Zenas if they survived him. It must all be judgment of some sort, though he could not fancy what for, since he had always walked uprightly in the Lord's way for so long as he knew. For over 2 weeks Amy saw nothing of Nahum, and then, worried about what might have happened, he overcame his fears and paid the gardener's place a visit. There was no smoke from the great chimney, and for a moment the visitor was apprehensive of the worst. The aspect of the whole farm was shocking. Grayish withered grass and leaves on the ground, vines falling in brittle wreckage from archaic walls and gambles, and great bare trees clawing up at the gray November sky with a studied malevolence which Amy could not but feel had come from some subtle change in the tilt of branches. But Nahum was alive, after all. He was weak, and lying on a couch in the low-ceiled kitchen. but perfectly conscious and able to give simple orders to Zenos. The room was deadly cold, and as Amy visibly shivered, the host shouted huskily to Zenos for more wood. Wood, indeed, was sorely needed, since the cavernous fireplace was unlit and empty, with a cloud of soot blowing about in the kitchen wind that came down the chimney. Presently Nahum asked him if the extra wood had made him any more comfortable, and then Amy saw what had happened. The stoutest cord had broken at last, and the hapless farmer's mind was proof against more sorrow. Questioning tactfully, Amy could get no clearer data at all about the missing Zenos. "In the well. He lives in the well," was all the clouded farmer would say. Then flashes across the visitor's mind thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line of inquiry. "Nabby, why, here she is," and was the surprised response of poor Nahum, and Amy soon saw that he must search for himself. Leaving the harmless babbler on the couch, he took the keys from the nail beside the door and climbed the creaking stair to the attic. It was very close and noisome up there, and no sound could be heard from any direction. Of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked, and on this he tried various keys on the ring he had taken. The 3rd one proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Amy threw open the low white door. It was quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by the crude wooden bars, and Amy could see nothing at all on the wide planked floor. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further had to retreat to another room, and returning with his lungs filled with breathable air. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. While he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a second later he felt himself brushed at as if by some hateful current of vapor. Strange colors danced before his eyes, and had not present horror numbed him, he would have thought of the globule and the meteor that the geologist's hammer had shattered, and the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. As it was, he thought only the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of young Thaddeus and livestock. But the terrible thing about this horror was that it was very slowly and perceptibly moved as it continued to crumble. Amy would give no added particulars to this scene. The shape in the corner does not reappear in his tale as a moving object. There are some things which cannot be mentioned, and what is done in common humanity is sometimes cruelly judged by the law. I gather that no other moving thing was left in the attic, and that to leave anything capable of motion there would have been a deed so monstrous as to damn any accountable being to eternal torment. Anyone but a stolid farmer would have fainted or gone mad. But Amy walked consciously through that low doorway and locked the accursed secret behind him. There would be Nahum to deal with now. He must be fed and tended, and removed to some place where he could be cared for. Commencing his descent of the dark stairs, Amy heard a thud below him. He even thought a scream had been suddenly choked off, and recalled nervously the clammy vapor which had brushed by him in that frightful room above. What presence had his cry and entry started up? Halted by some vague fear, he heard still further sounds below. Indubitably, there was some sort of heavy dragging, and most detestably sticky noise of some fiendish and unclean species of suction. With an associative sense of of goaded to feverish heights. He thought unaccountably of what he had seen upstairs. Good God! What eldritch dream world was this into which he had blundered? He dared to move neither backwards nor forwards, but stood there trembling at the dark curve of the boxed-in staircase. Every trifle of the scene buried itself into his brain. The sounds, the sense of dread expectancy, the darkness, the steepness of the narrow steps, and merciful heaven! The faint and unmistakable luminosity of the woodwork in sight, steps, sides, exposed laths, and beams alike. Then there burst forth a frantic whinny from Amy's horse outside, followed at once by a clatter which told of a frenzied runaway. In another moment, horse and buggy had gone beyond earshot, leaving the frightened man on the dark stairs to guess what he had seen. But that was not at all. There had been another sound. And out there, a sort of liquid splash, water. It seemed to have been the well. He had left Hero untied near it, and the buggy wheel must have brushed the coping and coping and knocked it in a stone. And still the pale phosphorescence glowed in the detestable ancient woodwork. God, how old the house was! Most of it was built before 1670, and the gambrel roof no later than 1730. A feeble scratching of the floor downstairs now sounded distinctly, and Amy's grip tightened on the heavy stick he had picked up in the attic for some purpose. Slowly nerving himself, he finished his descent and walked boldly towards the kitchen. But he did not complete the walk, because what he sought was no longer there. It had come to meet him, and it was still alive after a fashion. Whether it had crawled or whether it had been dragged by an external force, Amy could not say. But the death had been at it. Everything had happened in the last half hour, but collapse. Everything that had happened in the last half hour, but collapse, grain, and disintegration were already far advanced. There was a horrible brittleness, and dry fragments were scaling off. Amy could not touch it, but looked horrified into the distorted parody that had been a face. What was it, Nahum? What was it? He whispered, at the cleft, bulging lip where he was able to crack out a final answer. Nothing. Nothing. The color. It burns. Cold and wet. But it burns. It lived in the well. I seen it. A kind of smoke, just like the flowers last spring. The well shone at night. Thad and Murney and Zanus, everything alive, sucking the life out of everything in that stone. It must have come in that stone, poisoned the whole place. Don't know what it wants. That round thing them men from the college dug out in the stone, they smashed it. It was the same color, just the same like the flowers and plants. Must have been more of them. Seeds, they growed. I seen it first time this week of 'em. Must have got strong on Zenas. He was a big boy full of life. It beats down your mind and then gets ye, burns ye up. And the well water. You was right about that. Evil water. Zenas never came back from the well. Can't get away. They draws ye. Ye know something's a-comin', 'tain't no use. It seems in time again sect Zenas was took. Whar's Nabby, Amy? My head's no good. Don't know how long sect I fend her. I'll get her gun and if we Karen. Just don't know how long sect I feared her. Done. Just a color. Her face is getting to have the color sometimes towards night. And it burns and sucks. It comes from some place where things ain't as they hear. One of them professors said so. He was right. Look out, Amy. He'll do something more. Sucks the life out. But that was all. That which spoke could speak no more, because it had completely caved in. Amy laid a red-cheeked tablecloth over what was left, and reeled out the back door into the fields. He climbed the slope to the 10-acre pasture, and stumbled home by the north road in the woods. He could not pass that well from which his horse had ran away. He had looked at it through the window, and had seen that no more stone was missing from the rim. Then the lurching buggy had not dislodged it after all. The splash had been something else, something which went into the well after it had gone with poor Nahum. When Amy reached his house and the horse and buggy had arrived before him, and thrown his wife into fits of anxiety, reassuring her without explanations, he set out at once for Arkham and notified the authorities of that the Gardner family was no more. He indulged in no details, but merely told of the deaths of Nahum and Nabby. That of Thaddeus had already been known, and mentioned that the cause seemed to be strange ailments which had killed the livestock. He also stated that Merwin and Zanus had disappeared. There was considerable questioning at the police station, and in the end Amy was compelled to take 3 officers to the Gardner farm, together with the coroner and medical examiner and the veterinary who had treated the diseased animals. He went much against his will, for the afternoon was advancing, and he feared the fall of night over the accursed place. But it was some comfort to have so many people with him. The 6 men drove out in a Democrat wagon, following Amy's buggy, and arrived at the pest-ridden farmhouse about 4 o'clock. Used as the officers were to gruesome experiences, not one remained unmoved by what was found in the attic and under the reddish-cheeked tablecloth at the floor below. The whole aspect of the farm, with its gray desolation, was terrible enough. But those 2 crumbling objects were beyond all bounds. No one could look long at them, and even the medical examiner admitted that there was little to examine. Specimens could be analyzed, of course, and he busied himself in obtaining them. And here it develops that a very puzzling aftermath occurs at the college laboratory where the 2 phials of dust were finally taken. Under the spectroscope, both samples gave off an unknown spectrum in which many of the baffling bands were precisely like those that the strange meteor had yielded in the previous years. The property of emitting this spectrum vanished in a month, and dust thereafter, consisting mainly of alkaline phosphates and carbonates. Amy would not have told the men about the well if he had not thought they meant to do anything there then and there. It was getting towards sunset, and he was anxious to be away. He could not help glancing nervously at the stony curb by the giant sweep, and when a detective questioned him, he admitted that Nahum had feared something towards there, so much that he had never even thought of searching it for Merwin or Zenas. After that, nothing would do but that empty and explore the well immediately. So Amy had to wait trembling while pail after pail of rank water was hauled up and splashed on soaking ground outside. The men sniffed in disgust at the fluid, and towards the last held their noses against the factor they had against the factor they were uncovering. It was not so long as a job as they feared it would be, and since the water was phenomenally low, there is no need to speak too exactly of what they found. Merwin and Zenas were both there in part, though the vestiges were mainly skeletal. There was also a small deer and a large dog in about the same state, and a number of bones of smaller animals. The ooze and slime at the bottom seemed inexplicably porous and bubbling, and a man who descended on handholds with 2 long poles found that he could sink the wooden shaft to any depth in the mud of the floor without meeting any solid obstruction. Twilight had now fallen, and lanterns were brought from the house. Then, when it had seen that nothing further could be gained from the well, everyone went indoors and confirmed in the ancient sitting room, while the intermittent light of spectral half-moon played wanly on the gray desolation outside. The men were frankly nonplussed by the entire case, and could find no convincing common element to link the strange vegetable conditions, the unknown diseases of the livestock and humans, and the unaccountable deaths of Merwin and Zenas in the tainted well. They had heard the common country talk, it is true, but could not believe that anything contrary to natural law had occurred. No doubt the meteor had poisoned the soil, and the illness of persons and family who had eaten nothing grown in the soil was another matter. Was it the well water? Very possibly. It might be a very good idea to analyze it. But what peculiar madness could have made both boys jump into the well? Their deeds were so similar, and the fragments showed that they had both suffered from gray, brittle death. Was everything so gray and brittle? It was the coroner, seated near a window overlooking the yard, who first noticed the glow about the well. Night had begun to set in, and all the abhorrent grounds seemed faintly luminous and with more than fitful moonbeams. But this new glow was something definite and distinct, and appeared to shoot up from the black pit like a softened ray from a searchlight, giving dull reflections in the little ground pools where the water had been empty. It was a very queer color. As all the men clustered around the window, Amy gave a violent start. For the strange beam of ghastly miasma was to him of no unfamiliar hue. He had seen that color before, and feared to think what it might mean. He had seen it in the nasty brittle globule in the aerial light 2 summers ago. He had seen it in the crazy vegetation of the springtime. And he had thought he had seen it for an instant that very morning against the small barred window of the terrible attic room where nameless things had happened. It had flashed there a second, and clammy and hateful current of vapor had brushed past him, and then poor Nahum had been taken by something of that color. He had said so at the last, and said it was like the globule in the plants. After that had come the runaway in the yard and the splash in the well, and now the well was belching forth to the night a pale, insidious beam of the same demonic tint. It is not credit to the alertness of Amy's mind that he puzzled even at the Sorry. I need some more water. My throat is dry. It does credit to the alertness of Amy's mind that he puzzled even at the tense moment over a point which was essentially scientific. He could not but wonder, as his gleaning of the same impression from a vapor glimpsed in the daytime against a window opening on the morning sky, and for a nocturnal exaltation, seemed as a phosphorescent mist against the black and blasted landscape. It wasn't right. It was against nature. And he thought of those terrible last words of his stricken friend. It come from some place where things aren't as they is here. One of them professors said so. All 3 horses outside, tied to a pair of shriveled saplings on the road, were now neighing and pawing frantically. The wagon driver started for the door to do something, but Amy laid a shaky hand on his shoulder. Don't go out there, he whispered. There's more to this nor what we know now. Nahum said said something lived in the well that sucks your life out. He said it must be something that growed from a round ball like one we seen in the meteor stone that fell a year ago June. Sucks and burns, he said, and just a cloud of color like the light out of there now, and that ye hardly see, and can't tell what it is. Nahum thought it feeds on everything living, and gets stronger all the time. He said he's seen it in the last week. It had been something from away in the sky, like the men from the college last year said the meteor stone was. The way it's made and the way it works ain't like none of God's world. It's something from beyond. So the men paused indecisively at the light from the well grew. As the light from the well grew stronger, and the hitched horses pawed and whinnied in the increasing frenzy. It was truly an awful moment, with terror in the ancient and accursed house itself. 4 monstrous sets of fragments, 2 from the house and 2 from the well, in the woodshed behind, and the shaft of unknown and unholy iridescence from the slimy depths in the front. Amy had strained the driver on impulse, forgetting how uninquired he himself was after the clammy brushing of the colored vapor in the attic room, but perhaps it was just as well that he acted as he did. No one will ever know what was abroad that night, and though the blasphemy from beyond had not so far hurt any human of unweakened mind, there is no telling what it might have done at the last moment. And with its seeming increased strength and the special sight of purpose it was soon to display beneath the half-clouded moonlit sky. All at once, one of the detectives at the window gave a short, sharp gasp. The others looked at him, and then quickly followed his gaze upward towards the point at which its idle straying had been suddenly arrested. There was no need for words. What had been disputed in the country gossip was disputable no longer, as it is because the thing which every man of that partly agreed in the whispered later on that at strange days are never talked about in Arkham. It is necessary to premise that there was no wind at the hour of the evening. One did arise not long after, but there was absolutely none then. Even the dry tips of the lingering hedge mustard, gray and brittled, and at the fringe of the roof and standing Democrat wagon were unstirred. And yet amid the tense, godless calm, the high, bare boughs of all the trees in the yard were moving. They were twitching morbidly and spasmodically, clawing in convulsive and epileptic madness at the moonlight clouds, scratching impotently in the noxious air as it jerked by some alien and bodiless line of linkage with subterranean horrors writhing and struggling below the black woods. Not a man breathed for several seconds. Then a cloud of darker depth passed over the moon, and the silhouette of clutching branches faded out momentarily. At this there was a general cry, muffled with awe, but husky and almost identical from every throat. For the terror had not faded with the silhouette, and in a fearsome instant a deeper darkness that the watchers saw wriggling in the treetop height 1,000 tiny points a faint, unhallowed radiance, tipping each bough like the fire of St. Elmo or the flames that came down at the apostles' heads at Pentecost. It was a monstrous constellation of unnatural light, like a glutted swarm of corpse-fed fireflies dancing hellish sarabands over an accursed marsh, and its color was that of the same nameless intrusion which Amy had come to recognize and dread. All the while, the shaft of phosphorescence from the well was getting brighter and brighter, bringing in the minds of the huddled men a sense of doom and abnormality which far outraced any image their conscious minds could form. It was no longer shining out there. It was pouring out, and the shapeless stream of unplaceable color left of the well, it seemed, to glow directly into the sky. The veterinary shivered and walked to the front of the door to drop the extra heavy bar across it. Amy shook no less, and had to tug and point for lack of controllable voice when he wished to draw a notice to the growing luminosity of the trees. The neighing and stamping of the horses had become utterly frightful, but not a soul of that group in the old house would have ventured forth for any earthly reward. With the moments of the shining of the trees increased, while the restless branches seemed to strain more and more towards verticality. The woods of the well-sweep was shining now, and presently a policeman dumbly pointed to some woodsheds and beehives near the stone wall on the west. They were commencing to shine, too, though the tethered vehicles of the visitors seemed far unaffected. Then there was a wild commotion and a clopping in the road, and as Amy clenched the lamp for better seeing, they realized that the span of frantic grays had broke their sapling and run off with a Democrat wagon. The shock served to loosen several tongues, and embarrassed whispers were exchanged. "It spreads on evening organic that's been around here," muttered the medical examiner. No one replied, but the man who had been in the well gave a hint that his long pole must have stirred up something intangible. "It was awful," he added. "There was no bottom at all, just ooze and bubbles and the feeling of something lurking under there." Amy's horse still pawed and screamed deafeningly in the road outside, and nearly drowned in its farmer's faint quaver as he fumbled his formless reflections. "It come from the stone. It grow down thar. It got everything livin'. It fed itself on 'em, mind and body. That and Murney, Zenas, and Nabby. Nahum was the last, and they all drunk the water. It got strong on them. It came from beyond, where things ain't what they be here. Now it's going home." At this point, as the column of an unknown color flared suddenly stronger and began to weave itself into fantastic suggestions of shape which each spectre later described differently, there came from poor tethered hero such a sound as no man before or since has ever heard from a horse. Every person in the low-pitched sitting room stopped his ears, and Amy turned away from the window in horror and nausea. Words cannot convey it. When Amy looked out again, the hapless beast lay hurtled inert on the moonlit ground beneath the splintered shafts of the buggy. There was the last of Hero till they buried him the next day. But the present was no time to mourn, for almost at this instant a detective silently called attention to something terrible in the very room with them. In the absence of the lamplight, it was clear that a faint phosphorescence had begun to pervade the entire apartment. It glowed on the roof planked wood and the fragment of rag carpet, and shimmered over the sashes of small-paned windows. It ran up and down the exposed corner posts, coruscated about the shelf and mantel and infected the very doors and furniture. Each minute saw it strengthen, and at last it was very plain that healthy living things must leave that house. Amy showed them to the back door and the path up through the fields to go to the 10-acre pasture. They walked and stumbled as in a dream, and did not dare to look back until they were far away from the on the high ground. They were glad of the path, for they could not have gone from the front way, by the well, as it was bad enough passing the glowing barn and sheds, and those shining orchard trees with the gnarled, fiendish contours, but thank heavens the branches did their worst twisting high up. The moon went under some very black clouds as they crossed, and the rustic bridge over Chapman's Brook, and it was blind groping from there to the open meadows. When they looked back towards the valley and the distant Gardner place at the bottom, they saw a fearsome sight. All the farm was shining with a hideous unknown blend of color. Trees, buildings, and even such grass and herbage as it had been wholly changed to lethal gray bitterness. The boughs were all straining skyward, tipped with tongues of foul flame and lambent tricklings of the same monstrous fire were creeping out of the ridgepoles and the house barns and sheds. It was a scene from a vision of Fuseli, and over all the rest reigned the riot of luminous amorphousness and that alien, undimensioned rainbow of cryptic poison from the well, seething, feeling, lapping, reaching, scintillating, straining, and malignantly bubbling in its cosmic, unrecognizable chromaticism. Then, without a warning, the hideous thing shot vertically up towards the sky like a rocket or meteor, leaving behind no trail and disappearing through a round and curious regular hole in the sky before a man could gasp or cry out. No watcher can ever forget that sight, and Amy stared blankly at the stars of Cygnus Deneb twinkling above the others when the unknown color had melted into the Milky Way. But his gaze was the next moment called swiftly to earth by the crackling in the valley. It was just that, only a wooden rippling and a crackling, and not an explosion, as so many others of the party vowed. Yet the outcome was the same, for it was one feverish, kaleidoscopic instance that burst up from that doomed and accursed farm, a gleaming, eruptive cataclysm of unnatural sparks and substance, blurring the glance of the few who saw it, and sending forth to the zenith a bombarding cloudburst of such colored and fantastic fragments as our universe must needs disown. Though quickly reclosing vapors, they followed the great morbidity that had vanished, and in another second they had vanished too. Behind and below was only a darkness to which the men dared not return, and all about was a morning wind which seemed to sweep down into black, frore gusts from its interstellar space. It shrieked and howled and lashed the fields of the distorted woods in a mad cosmic frenzy, till soon the trembling party realized it would be no use waiting for the moon to show what was left there at Nahum's. Too awed even to hint theories, the 7 shaking men trudged towards Arkham to the North Road. Amy was worse than his followers, and begged them to see him inside his own kitchen, instead of keeping straight on the road. He did not wish to cross the nighted, wind-whipped woods alone to his home on the main road, for he had an added shock that the others were spared, and was crushed forever with a brooding fear he dared not even mention for many years to come. As the rest of the watchers on the impetuous hill had stolidly set their faces towards the road, Amy had looked back at an instant at the shadowed valley of desolation so lately sheltered his ill-starred friend. And from that stricken, faraway spot he had seen something feebly rise, only to sink down again upon the place which the great shapeless horror had shot into the sky. It was just a color, but not any color of our earth or heavens. And because Amy recognized that color, and knew that this last faint remnant must still lurk down there in the well, he had never quite been right since. Amy would never go near the place again. It was over half a century now since the horror happened, but he had never been there, and will be glad when the new reservoir blots it out. I shall be glad too, for I do not like the way the sunlight changed color around the mouth of that abandoned well I passed. I hope the water will always be very deep, and even so, I shall never drink it. I do not think I shall visit Arkham country hereafter. 3 of the men who had been with Amy returned the next morning to see the ruins by daylight, but they were not any real ruins. Only the bricks of the chimney and the stones of the cellar, and some mineral and metallic glitter here and there, and the rim of the nefarious well. Save for Amy's dead horse, which they had towed away and buried, and the buggy which he returned to him, everything there living had been gone. 5 eldritch acres of dusty gray desert remained, nor had anything ever grown there since. To this day it sprawled open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in woods and fields, and few had ever dared glimpse, in spite of the rural tales have named it the Blasted Heath. The rural tales are strange. They might be even stranger if city men and college chemists could be interested enough to analyze the water from the disused well, or the gray dust that no wind seemed to ever disperse. Botanists, too, ought to study the stunted flora of on the borders of that spot, and for they might shed light on the country notion that the blight is spreading, little by little, perhaps an inch each year. People say the color of the neighboring herbage is not quite right in the spring, and that wild things leave strange prints in light winter snow. Snow never seems quite so heavy on the Blasted Heath as it is elsewhere. Horses, the few that are left in this motor age, grow skittish in the silent valley, and hunters cannot depend on their dogs too near the splotch of grayish dust. They say the mental influences are very bad, too. Numbers went strange in the years after Nahum's taking, and always they lacked the power to get away. Then the strong-minded folk all left the region, and only the foreigners tried to live in the crumbling old homesteads. They could not stay, though, and one sometimes wonders what insight beyond ours their wild, weird stories of whispered magic had given them. The dreams at night, they protest, are very horrible in that grotesque country, and surely the very look of dark realm is enough to stir a morbid fancy. No traveler has ever escaped a sense of strangeness in those deep ravines, and artists shiver as they paint thick woods whose mystery is as much of the spirit as it is of the eye. I myself am curious about the sensation I derived from my one lone walk before Amy told me his tale. When twilight came, I had vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the sky voids above had crept into my soul. Do not ask me for my opinion. I do not know, that is all. There is no one there was no one but Amy to question, for Arkham people will not talk about the strange days. And all 3 professors who saw the aerolite and its colored globule are dead. There were other globules. Depend upon that. One must have fed itself and escaped, and probably there was another which was too late. No doubt it is still down in the well. I know there was something wrong with the sunlight I saw above the miasmal brink. The rustics say the blight creeps in an inch a year, so perhaps there is a kind of growth or nourishment even now. But whatever demon hatchling is there, it must be tethered or something else, or else it could quickly spread. Is it fastened to the roots of those trees that claw the air? On the current Arkham tale, one of the current Arkham tales is about fat oaks that shine and move as they ought not to at night. What it is, only God knows. In terms of matter, I suppose the thing Amy described would be called a gas. But this gas obeyed laws that were not of our cosmos. This was no fruit of such worlds and suns as shine on the telescopes and photograph plates of our observatories. This was no breath from the skies whose mentions and dimensions our astronomers measure or deem too vast to measure. It was just a color out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity beyond all nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with black extracosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. I doubt very much if Amy consciously lied to me, and I do not think his tale was as all a freak of madness as the townfolks had foretold. Something terrible came to the hills and valleys on that meteor, and something terrible, though I know not in what proportion, still remains. I shall be glad to see the water come. Meanwhile, I hope nothing will happen to Amy. He saw so much of the thing, and its influence was so insidious. Why has he never been able to move away? How clearly he recalled those dying words of Nahum's. Can't get away. Draws ye. He knows something's a-comin', but 'tain't no use. Amy is such a good old man. When the reservoir gangs get to work, I must write the chief engineer to keep a sharp watch on him. I would hate to think of him as the gray, twisted, brittle monstrosity which persists more and more in troubling me in my sleep. Well, folks, thus completes The Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft. And whoo doggy, that was a long one. I think I am going to stop there for now. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Hopefully this has not spooked you out of sleep, but instead invigorated you to avoid meteorites and people with lanterns in the dark and ravens and things like that. But anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful night. Stay classy, stay sassy, stay gassy. I will see you next time.